It is called A Man Who Found Christmas. It was written by Walter Pritchard Eaton in 1913. So let's see. This is not it's like a young adult, more story. So here it goes. The Man Who Found Christmas. Thank you, Patrick. All right. Are we ready? Do we like the whisper or the soft voice? If you want me to whisper, we'll do both. All right. Nice and calm. Snuggle down and let's begin. The Man Who Found Christmas. There is nothing more humdrum and conventional than the life of a young bachelor in New York. If this statement destroys anybody's illusions, we are sorry, but the truth must be told. Wallace Miller was a young bachelor in New York, and the only unconventional thing in his life was the To Hell with Merry Yuletides Association, which met every Christmas Eve and dined. And alas, even that dinner was conventional. Delmonico's and the dress code. His profane association with the 6 members. There was Mercer, who had organized it and supplied the original profanity. He was the city editor of a daily paper and had to work on Christmas Day, so perhaps he may be forgiven. There was Jack Gleason, formerly one of Mercer's reporters, but now a playwright who supplied most of the good spirits, which Mercer said was no wonder since he had an income of $20,000 a year. There was Gilsey, a short, dark, thick-set, scowling man with an astonishing vocabulary and all instincts of a born ironclast, who by the day was sub-editor of a mildly religious weekly. There was Smith and Stedman, brokers and clubmates of Miller's, who resembled closely their kind, even to the angle at which they pushed back their hats when sitting in the club before dinner. Finally, there was Wallace Miller himself, who had begun a New York career after leaving college. As a reporter under Mercer, like Gleason, but being blessed, if it was a blessing, with a small inherited income, had abandoned journalism for letters and sought to create literature in a littered apartment down a side street not too far from his club and the magazine office. When Mercer had broached to him the idea of the To Hell with Merry Yuletide Association, he had fallen eagerly into the scheme. Fine, he cried. I loathe Christmas. The club is always so desolate on that day, and the service so bad. Every year you have to subscribe to an employee's Christmas fund. And then, when the day arrives, half of the employees are missing, and the rest act as if they wish they were. There's nobody to dine with. You have to sit in the general table with men you don't know, and every last one of them eats as his food choked him. It's worse than Sundays in August. Besides, I have an aunt in Somerville, Massachusetts, who always sends me a present. You bet I'm for the association. The other four members had been carefully selected from, from a host of declared that he personally would support Christmas as soon as everybody he knew really gave Christianity a trial. But under the circumstances, he felt it was safe in taking out a life membership. So the new association was assembled and held its first dinner on Christmas Eve, where plans for the next summer's vacations were discussed. The dinner was followed by ensuing year, by a second, and again by a third, for there had been no defections from the ranks. They seemed, indeed, matrimonially and Christmas spiritually impregnable. December of the fourth year had come, and with it a snowstorm. Wallace Miller still lived in his littered apartment down a side street and a little more presumptuous than of old, but even more wedded to his habits. He was digging in the bottom drawer of an old secretary one afternoon, hunting for a long buried manuscript after the fashion of authors, when he came upon a bundle of ancient souvenirs, dusty and forgotten, dropping all other tasks as one will suddenly confronted with visible tokens of one's past. He untied the parcel and began going through it. It was a motley collection, the program of his preparatory school class day exercises, the class prophecy he had read on that occasion, full of names, many of which he could not now connect with, the forgotten faces, a dance card equally full of disembodied initials, a photograph of an old square house amid an apple tree where he had lived in as a boy, and which he tenderly laid aside, another photograph of a face between parted strands of heavy hair, a face once loved with the chivalristic passion of 17. Wallace looked at this picture a long time as the memories crowded back upon him, and laid it back with a wistful smile. Then he resumed his inspection of the package. Next came a blank book full of quotations copied in a boyish hand, and most sentimentally, and another blank book labeled Story Plots. He remembered that one. It was compiled when he was trying for the preparatory school's literary monthly. The plots were amusing, melodramatic. Below these books came souvenirs of still earlier years, which must have been saved by his mother, childish compositions, a letter he had written home when he went to his first visit without his parents, and finally a big Christmas card. As he turned this card to the light to see it better, a sudden wave of memories swept in over the threshold of his consciousness, and he sat quite still while they had their way with him. The card, in color, depicted a small boy in a long nightie, standing before a big fireplace with his hands stretched to the blaze. The warm red glow of the fire illuminated his face and nightie. From the mantel hung a stocking. Behind him was a window with small leaded panes, and through this window you saw a church roof, white with snow, and the cold moon riding high below the picture in Old English type were the words, Merry Christmas. Long, long ago, in the forgotten, dim years of childhood, he had loved that card. Once he recalled he had taken it to bed with him. The cold moonlight, in contrast to the warm red fire, had fascinated him, and the great wallowing flames and the jolly stocking. Dimly, there came back to him the awareness of the white roofs visible from his own window in the moonlight, of his own stocking hung up, of wallowing flames, of his father's big, hearty voice, and a Christmas tree in the morning with a red sled under the branches and a star on top. He sat on the floor with the card in his lap, still and silent. The story is called The Man Who Found Christmas. It was written in 1913, so it's more of a young adult story, not a children's story tonight. So The Man Who Found Christmas is our story. Welcome on in, Brett. Outside the streets, outside the snow was falling steadily. It was growing dim in the room. The steam pounded suddenly in the radiator. Wallace looked up angrily. The place was certainly gloomy, lonely, oppressive. He put the card hastily back into the package, slamming the door shut, and set off for his club without lighting the lamps. Outside, the streets were already sloppy with snow, and the horses were falling down. Wallace vaguely recalled a boyhood delight at the first snowfall, his dash into the drifts, upturning his face to meet the soft sting of the descending flakes. He turned his face up now, and snow went down his collar. He looked down again and saw that the bottom of his newly pressed trousers were getting dragged. Stepping off the curb into an apparently firm drift, he sank ankle deep in gutter slosh. He swore crossly to himself as he stomped and shook the snow from his feet and his garments, entering the club. It was that hour preceding dinner when the club was full. Warm greetings. Welcome in. Let me see if we can get this going as we read. Thank you. CWM Farm, welcome in. It was that hour when the young man, like himself, were sitting in a group in the grill room, their hats tipped back on their heads, canes across their laps, highball glasses before them. He could hear confused scrapes of their conversation. Took a tumble today, all right. If it goes much lower, I'll wipe my margins. You bet, it's some show, and that girl's on. No, you should have just made it no trumps. In corners, men were absorbed in the asinine game of dominoes. Wallace suddenly reflected the amount of dominoes playing which goes on in New York clubs is a good argument for women's suffrage. Several men hailed him with the usual, "What's yours?" But he passed them by and went up to the squash courts. There, at last, men were getting exercise, he thought. The courts were full, so that he could not play. They smelled sweaty and stale. He went back downstairs and found Smith and Stedman, just up from downtown, joining them in the inevitable cocktail. We're reading The Man Who Found Christmas. It is a 1913 story tonight. About time we began to plan our to hell with the merry Yuletide feast, isn't it? Stedman asked. I noticed today that all the shops were crowded, and a poor gink in our office showed me a ring he had to buy for his wife. The silly season is upon us. I suppose it is, said Wallace, suddenly reminded of their association. Well, thank you so much. I will be sure to return the love. Thank you. I hope your electricity comes back on soon. All the way over from Jamaica. Great to see you. I suppose it is time, said Wallace, suddenly reminded of their association. I shan't be out of town for Christmas. What's that? Cried the others. Wallace was rather surprised himself at his words, for he hadn't the slightest intention till that moment of being out of town. But the card had made him unconsciously long for Christmas, for a real Christmas, such as his childhood knew. Welcome in, Mins. Welcome in. I might take a trip soon, he replied. I'm a bit stale on town. We're reading The Man Who Found Christmas. Nonsense, said Smith. You are the most confirmed New Yorker of the bunch. You'll be here. Where on earth could you go? Wallace made no reply. He didn't know where he could go to find a welcome, and thought somehow hurt him. They went out to the dining room and consumed the usual fare, every item of which could be predicted. After dinner, the CWM fam will be sending love and prayers for your electricity and for everyone in Jamaica that's still suffering. We remember. After dinner, they went to the theater where they knew to a new musical comedy, and every song and dance and joke of which could be predicted with equal certainty. Then Wallace went home to his apartment after the usual half hour at the club for a nightcap. It was cold and dismal in the apartment. As usual, Nikki, he could suddenly reflect the next morning. It is still dismal. Rather than work, he went into the street through Madison Square, which showed some traces of yesterday's snow, and up the avenue. The shops were happy. The toys' windows attracted him. He saw many children going inside with radiant faces. One of them smiled at him. I'd like to give somebody something, he suddenly thought. It would seem rather nice. He walked on. The pavement and walks were sloppy, but all the faces were cheerful. Christmas seemed to be in the air. Wallace felt curiously aloof from the life about him, isolated, lonely. Why, he hated Christmas. Was it not perhaps just because he was lonely and isolated? Was not the fault with him, but rather with Christmas? This was a disconcerting reflection. He put it away from him and went to the club for lunch. Gilsey was there holding forth. Again, the government, as the old phrase has it. Christmas, he was saying. Christmas is now degenerating into a season when most people have to study out how they can afford to give useless presents to all the people who give them useless presents. They can't afford it, but they do it. Getting generous by calendar is almost as spontaneous as kissing your wife. If you're so unfortunate to have one, by the clock. It's rather nice, as I remembered it, Wallace interrupted. What? Roared Gilsey. It too? You better consult a doctor. Gilsey, the other answered, did you ever try the bandwagon instead of the scorner's seat on the brownstone step? Gilsey looked at his friend with comical expression and quite genuine grief. I don't know what you mean, Wally, he said. Never mind, said the other contritely. Doubtless, I don't mean anything. I've been a bit upset by a memory of my dead life. That's all. But after lunch, he returned to his apartment and took the memoir from the drawer again, looking tenderly at the little chap in the firelit nightie. My dead life. Yes, he reflected sentimentally, touched by the memory. That Christmas spirit of those days cannot be found. Can it not be found again? Is one foolishly seeking a lost Eden to search for it? Moonlight on a white world, a Christmas tree, the merry screams of children. Of children. His reflection trailed off into incoherence, and chiefly he was aware of an oppressive sense of loneliness. The thought of his club bored him. Gilsey, with his eternal knocking, bored him. The To Hell with the Merry Yuletide Association struck him as rather a farce, not to say a pose. He wanted Christmas. That was the size of it. He wanted something he did not possess, and in his present surroundings could not possess. He was living outside of Christmas. I'm not a sort of man without a country, he suddenly thought. Gilsey, Smith, Gleason, we all are. We're single men in New York. I'm going to find Christmas. I'm going to find moonlight on the white roofs. I'm going to find that kid in the white nightie. He rose abruptly and began to pack his bag and steamer trunk. He had no idea where he was going, but he was very cheerful. He felt like whistling and found himself whistling with a long forgotten tune which his father had sung to him 20 years before. It was the ancient carol of the good King Wenceslas. That evening he did not go to the club to dine. The next morning, early, he was at Grand Central Station, where the selected various timetables and hotel guides, and retired with them to the waiting room. He might not have gone to the town of his birth and childhood, but for many reasons he did not care to. A trolley he knew ran past the big house where he had lived. Perhaps the house no longer stood there. The spawn of the city had by now reached the village. It would no longer be the country, but the suburbs. He did not want the suburbs. Neither did he desire to hazard enjoying Christmas in the shouts of children whose mother's picture now reposed in his dusty drawer amid the souvenirs of his buried youth. So he ran through a list of stations till his eyes chanced upon North Topsville, Massachusetts. The name pleased him. There was a South Topsville, also Topsville itself. did not exist as far as the railway was concerned. South anything, he reflected, is usually the part of the community which has the mills and motion pictures theater. Just why nobody has satisfaction explained, so he cast his lot in with North Topsail and purchased a ticket for that place. Thank you, Renee Bradley. Welcome in, and thank you for my beautiful gifts. We're reading The Man Who Found Christmas. He's been unhappy and now he's setting off to find it. In North Topsail, an hour later, he was sitting in a Pullman car and leaving New Rochelle behind. By the time the train was well up into New England hills, it had begun to snow. Wallace looked out of the car window, fascinated by the panorama of reddish gray hillsides seen through the white storm. A station after station was passed, each taking its quota of passengers from the train. Each passenger met on the platform by welcome friends or relatives. The Pullman began to be almost empty. Wallace felt lonely. There would be nobody to welcome him at North Topsville. He felt rather sorry he had come when he reflected on this. After all, his search was probably hopeless. He ate luncheon and became more cheerful, for the train was passing out of the storm into the glittering white world of broad valleys and lovely hills and snug farmhouses on the road between the tidy New England villages, where beautiful naked elms arched the street. At South Topsville, sure enough, there was a big mill, and down the street from the station, a motion picture theater. Wallace grinned at the correctness of his intuition. Almost feminine, he thought, and began to put on his coat. The train ran into heavy, snowy meadows, into a strip of woodlands and swamp, and then emerged into the gentle intervals where graceful vase elms fringed a stream, and came to a stop at the North Topville station. Wallace alighted, the only passenger to do so, and the train moved on. He stood with his grip beside and looked about. The station was a small one. Beyond it, a road stretched across the meadow to the valley or the village street, where he saw a white steeple. On the other side of the tracks lay the snowy field with the road and 2 or 3 farmhouses upon it. Then the steep walls of a mountain. The station agent was up on the platform examining his trunk. Beside the platform stood an ancient and vintage. Stood a pung of ancient and vintage, and it was seated a young man swinging his arms against his chest for warmth. Wallace took a step towards him, and the youth nodded. "Be you going to the hotel?" he said. "I am, if there is one." And you are?" Wallace answered. "I be, if you be," said the youth. "And there is ever to come back again for the trunk," he added. "Most folks come here in winter is drummers, and they travel light. Simple case and toothbrush, and a copy of the Saturday Evening Post. What's your line?" "Christmas," Wallace answered with a laugh as the pung moved across the meadows to the cold, crisp country air. "Wall, I reckon now's the time to sell that," the young man answered imperturbably. Quite a brisk demand for it these days. My little gal, she write a letter to Santa that's going to tonight bust him. I reckon he'd be him being me. Have you a little girl? Wallace asked in surprise. Girl, I got two of 'em, but other only 6 months and ain't very good at spelling yet, the driver replied. Why not? I've been married more'n 5 years. I'm 26. Wallace made no answer. He was 30 himself and felt curiously ashamed. Welcome in, everybody. We are reading The Man Who Found Christmas. At the door of the Mason house, he gave the driver $1. Keep the change for the little girl, he said, and looked rather surprised. The other looked rather surprised, but finally put back his little bag of change into his pocket. Well, seeing you put it that way, I will, he said, but I don't just like it. I'm a long way from New York, thought Wallace as he entered the hotel. The Mason house of North Topsail was a relic of past generations. Large Doric pillars in front gave it the air of dignified antiquity, but the interior was surprisingly neat and clean, though darkened by the protecting portico. That it should remain open during the winter months surprised Wallace at first, but he learned later that most of the business visitors to the South Topville Mills stayed here, attracted by the superior accommodation and rather famous kitchen, while a certain number of health seekers could always be relied on. He signed the register and was escorted to his room, a large old-fashioned chamber with a broken Piedmont. An old-fashioned chamber with a broken Piedmont, like a highboy top over the door and an open fireplace. He ordered a fire laid at once and began unpacking his bag. Outside the village streets, he could hear sleigh bells jingle, and presently the shouts of children going home from school. As soon as his trunk had come, he put on a woolen cap, which pulled down over the ears, purchased the day before in New York, and hastened out of doors. The village street was packed hard by the sleigh runners. There was half a dozen old-fashioned stores here in the town center, a white church, a small stone library, a bank, and a town hall. The town hall was built of brick, a simple rectangular block with white stone trimming, and looked very cheerfully over the snow. Out of the town center, on either direction, the main street led beneath graceful arches of bare elm boughs into white country. Wallace turned west, following a crowd of children with sleds and toboggans. For a quarter of a mile, the street was lined with substantial old houses, several of them of considerable architectural beauties, and nearly all apparently surrounded by lawns and gardens. North Topsville was evidently still a good specimen of too rapidly disappearing type of aristocratic New England village. It seemed to the man as he walked along behind the children that he was less a stranger here than in New York. He felt as if he was coming back home. He walked with the memories of his own childhood in such a town, and the intervening years faded from his consciousness. He half expected to meet somebody whom he should recognize, and once, indeed, seeing a girl's figure coming down the path from a Doric porch behind, guarding evergreens, his heart gave a sudden bound, for it appeared to his excited imagination to be the figure of her, whose picture he had so recently unearthed. Most people probably know that curious sensation of false recognition. Blessings, Barry. Welcome in. We are reading The Man Who Found Christmas. If we have been thinking much of a person, we will often see him a score of times in a single day, ahead of us in a crowd, perhaps, or sitting across the theater. At any rate, the shock of this sensation accounted for Wallace Miller's pronounced stare at the girl's face. When they met at her gate, her eyes turned to his gaze for a second, as if she, too, were appraising him, and then she passed quickly, leaving behind on the keen winter air the faintest of perfumes. Not the perfume which comes in the bottle, but which comes from garments kept in lavender, from soap, and from health. The man drew a long breath, rather astonished at the acuteness of his nasal sense. Long unused to subtler perfumes and pleasurably warmed by the encounter, he looked sharply at the house from which the girl had come to fix it in his memory. There were plants at several of the square, small planted windows, and the tracks of sled and toboggans all over the lawn. Behind it, he could hear children screaming and laughing. He walked more briskly. The road soon passed into more open country, and to the right was a long, smooth field ending in a hill slope. Field and slope were alive with sleds and children, their shouts making a shrill, ceaseless chorus, almost like spring frogs. The man climbed through the fence and ascended the slope, attracting a few curious glances from the coasters, and stood at the top watching the sport. He felt ridiculously shy. He wanted to coast. He wanted to join the sport, but he did not know how to begin. Nobody spoke to him. There was a group of red-cheeked high school girls there, but his coming caused no flutter or whisper among them, as he knew it would had he been younger. This made him feel uncomfortable and unreasonably old. The smaller boys were paying no attention to anybody except themselves. Thank you, Miss. The smaller girls were timely coasting on a gentler incline of their own and doing a great deal of screaming. Two busy small boys were industriously hauling up a big toboggan and bumping down on it over the runner tracks, hard put to keep from swerving and upsetting them. Presently, two other toboggans appeared and had the same difficulty on the smooth, uncharted hill. The man finally plucked up his courage, smiling to himself at his own embarrassment, and asked the owner of the first toboggan why he didn't build a slide. "Don't know," said the young person. "What's a slide?" "You don't know what a slide is?" exclaimed Wallace, glad to see that his scorn made an evident impression. "The only real way to get speed and distance out of a toboggan is to have a slide. You use up half your speed now by the friction of steering. All you have to do is make up two banks of snow a couple of feet apart to keep the sleds out. Then the chute between the banks will get almost a glare of ice. You won't have to bother to steer, and you can go a mile a minute clear at the other end of the pasture." "Gee, let's build one, Joe!" exclaimed the second smaller boy. boy. Ain't got no shovel. If you'll bring shovels tomorrow afternoon, I'll help you, said Wallace. Tomorrow's Saturday, the boy replied with scorn. So it is. I forgot. Well, how about 9 o'clock tomorrow morning then? You're on, Judge, said Joe, easily as he kicked the toboggan around to face down the slope. Want to try a ride? Wallace sat down on the cushionless toboggan between the two boys, and with a yell of warning, they started off. The additional weight in the center made the task of steering too much for the helmsman. Two-thirds of the way down, the toboggan began to pivot, skidding madly to the left, upset and rolling all three of the riders over and over in the snow. They picked themselves up, laughing, while other coasters behind shouted and jeered. The man's wrist and neck were full of snow. His nose was scratched by a piece of crust. His eyes were weeping, but he laughed as he rose. That won't happen when we get the slide, he said. Oh, that's fun, the owner of the toboggan answered. Want to try it again? I think I'll wait until tomorrow, said Wallace. Goodbye till tomorrow. So long, said the boys, turning from him at once, so as if he no longer existed. He went back to the road, digging snow out of his neck and sleeves, and feeling rather sore and wretched. In front of the house, with the Doric porch, he now observed a toboggan standing. The girl was nowhere visible, but the toboggan was a hopeful possibility. He went back to the hotel and unpacked his trunk while the early twilight came on and his wood fire sparkled cheerfully. He felt cheerful again himself now and sleepy with the unaccustomed country air and pleasantly tired and hungry. Supper was announced by a big bell clanging in the lower hall, and it was an excellent meal with real maple syrup to pour on piping hot griddle cakes. Still sleepier and more content, Wallace went back to his room to read, nodding over the pages in front of his fire, and finally decided to go to bed at the unheard of hour of 9. After he had undressed and turned out the light, he suddenly became aware of the moonlight. Going to his window, he saw it gleaming palely on the white roof of the church. The village street was still and almost deserted. The 2 stories were closed, save for the distant sleigh bell. There was hardly a sound. He opened the window and sent his breath steaming out into the night, then sucked back such a great lungful of the sweet, stinging cold air. With a final glance at the white roof sleeping in the moonlight, he tumbled into bed as the clock solemnly boomed 9 o'clock, almost before the last reverberation had died away into the silence. He was asleep. He was awakened in the morning by a clamor of breakfast bells, breaking strangely in upon his dreams, and for several moments he lay in bed enjoying the odd sensation of sunshine in his chambers and the comparative quiet of the world outside. He heard sleigh bells in the village street, the voice of somebody saying good morning to somebody else with the old Yankee nasal inflection, which was like forgotten music to his ears. At 8:30, he was through his breakfast and set forth to find a snow shovel and a toboggan. There were plenty of shovels about, but only one toboggan in the store. That's the last one, the storekeeper said. Kind of thought I weren't going to sell it. Seems it's $6. The rest was 3 or 4. Would you like the cushion too? Kind of absorbs the shock. Wallace took the cushions too and set out down the main street, dragging his new purchase and feeling rather sheepishly. Nobody, however, paid him much attention. He looked for the girl in the house behind the evergreens, but she was not visible. The toboggan was still standing beside the Doric porch. He passed on vaguely disappointed and was soon at the hillside. His 2 friends from yesterday were already there, with them 6 other small boys, with a total of 4 snow shovels. Eventually, the word had gone forth that an untoward events were on. Wallace was secretly pleased and rather flattered. He felt so shy with these boys that their response seemed to him a compliment. "Good morning," he cried. "Well, you're ahead of time. I bet you didn't get to school so early." The boys grinned at this, looking at each other. Wallace felt more at ease. Let me take a sip. Gotta adjust, guys. "Well," he said, "let's get busy right away. Let's build the slide somewhere so it won't interfere with the sleds. Over here a little to the left, eh?" The boys followed him to the left of the slope, and under his direction they began to work. It did not take them long to rise banks nearly 2 feet high halfway down the hill, but before this much was completed, a score of other coasters had arrived and come over to watch the work. One large boy with a sled got into the incomplete slide and came whizzing down. "Hi, get out of that!" yelled the workers. "This is for toboggans." "Oh, chase yourself. I'm going down it again," said the coaster as he came up back the hill. "No, you're not. Is he, sir?" cried the workers. Thus appealed to everybody. Looked at Wallace, including the large boy. The individual spoke up so quickly. "I guess this hill's as much mine as it is yours," he said, characteristic aggressiveness of his type, "and I'll coast where I please." Wallace looked at him sharply. "You are considerably of a bully, aren't you?" He said. "Well, I am something of a bully myself. We've left all this hill to sleds except this narrow strip, which is going to be for toboggans. Everybody who's decent will keep out of it with sleds. Anybody who isn't decent, who's mean and nasty and selfish, not thoughtful of other people, will have me and all these 8 boys to reckon with. Now, young men, you go ahead and try to coast here if you care to." Wallace's voice didn't raise above a conversational key, but he looked the bully square in his eyes, and that individual slunk off to the other side of the hill. The smaller boys looked at the man with evident admiration and began to talk excitedly. "Gee," whispered Joe to Wallace, "Jim's never got a Lansing down like that before. I bet he comes and spoils the slide tonight, though. When we get it done, we'll offer to take him down on a toboggan. That's the way to pull his teeth. He'd be ashamed then, maybe." No sooner had he spoken than something made him turn. Standing close behind was the girl of yesterday. In the excitement, she had come up the hill without his seeing. She was dressed in a white Angora wool cap with a white Angora sweater and a short, heavy skirt with heavy knee boots below it. She held her toboggan rope in her hand, and beside her stood a yellow-haired youngster of 6 with cheeks like 2 ripe apples. She was looking at Wallace. He unconsciously smiled and half nodded as his gaze met her. She spoke rather to all the boys than to him. "That's right," she said. "You scorched Jim's head with coal and fire, and maybe it'll do him some good. Some of these boys are in my Sunday school class," she added more directly to Wallace, "so I'll just get a day ahead with the lesson." And the boys all laughed at this, and Wallace said, "That's right, carpe diem," in a new sense. Then, lest he seem rude, he reluctantly turned back to the slide. Presently, he saw the girl and her small charge tobogganing down the hill. He sent 2 of his own gang, as he called them, down the slide to see how it worked, and set the rest to completing the bottom part. It was soon done, and with a shout, all the 8 boys piled up to the top, crowded aboard the toboggans, and one after the other went yelling down. After a few trips, the bottom was so packed and smooth, the coaster scooted clean across the pasture at the bottom to the very road. "Gee, this is great!" cried one of them. "You bet! Best we've ever had!" shouted another. Wallace looked along the hilltop and saw the girl. "Run and tell your teacher, Joe, that the slide is for everybody who has a toboggan. Is that her son with her?" "Oh, she's Miss Woodford. That's her sister kid," said Joe, scampering off while Wallace felt a secret relief and a glow of pleasure. Joe returned with the girl and 2 other younger girls who had a toboggan. "We built the slide for everybody," said Wallace. "Miss Woodford, it's for toboggans, so they won't have to be steered. The sides make it perfectly safe, even for children. Try it." "It's very nice of you," the girl smiled. "Our boys here in Topsville need a man to inspire and direct their play. I fear I'm a poor hand and very inexperienced one, but I'm having a good time. Doubtless that is why the boys are," she replied as she tucked her skirts around her trim boot legs, holding her little nephew to hang on tight, and Wallace pushed them over the brim. The slide grew more and more slippery, and the fun more and more furious. Even the coasters came over to watch or beg friends for rides. Even Jim, the bully, cast envious eyes towards the slide. "Now's a good time," said Wallace to a couple of boys. "Go offer Jim a ride." "You do it, Joe," said one of the boys. "No, you do it." "What's the matter? Are you afraid?" said the man. "You just show him once you're not afraid of him, and he'll come down off his high horse." "Oh, I ain't afraid," cried Joe, going at once towards the bully. "Come on and try the slide on my toboggan, Jim." Then the rest heard him say. Jim scowled and hung back for a moment, but his curiosity got the better of him, and he came. "Take my toboggan, Joe," said Wallace. "It's bigger than yours." Joe took it, and Jim the bully and another boy and 2 girls piled on and went screaming down the slide. The man smiled and turned and met the smile of Miss Woodford. "Won't you try mine?" she said. He put her in front and held the small nephew between them. That young person was very solemn. Wallace could feel the muscles of his little arms tightened as he gripped the toboggan rails. His little face was set, his lips parted, his yellow hair blown about his temples from under his cap. He was deliciously frightened by the speed. As they came to rest at the bottom, however, he automatically relaxed and let out a bottled up yell. Having a good time, son? Asked Wallace as the small hand grasped the rope beside him. My name is Albert Andrew Goodwin, said the young person replied, and all in one breath. I think this slide is the best fun I've ever had. Wallace laughed, and so did the girl. My name is Wallace Miller, and I quite agree with you, he answered. My name is Nora Woodford, and I'm not inclined to present a minority report. The girl smiled. What is that, Auntie Nora? That thing you just said, demanded Albert Andrew Goodwin. It is my way of saying the slide is lots of fun, she replied. Why didn't you just say it then? The boy asked. Again, the grown-ups laughed, and Wallace felt a curious thrill through his glove and his little as the little hand beside him on the toboggan rope pressed close against his fingers at the top. The small fellow took actual hold of his hand with an almost engaged smile and demanded that he steer them down again. This time Albert sat at the front, and Wallace gasped and grasped the rails at either side of the girl to hold her on while she put protecting hands about her nephew. The slide was already like glass and was developing a few spots where the banks were not quite true, and the toboggans were thrown from side to side. Two-thirds of the way down, little Albert was whipped so sharply to the left that he let go of the rail. His aunt, with a scream, grabbed him hard and shifted her weight with a little more than Wallace could counteract. At that speed they were traveling, the toboggan rolled madly up the bank at an oblong angle and shot over the other side, burying its nose into a drift and sending all three riders overboard in a complete header. Wallace was on his feet in a second and had his arms about the girl, lifting her, for she saw the child must be underneath. Are you hurt? He cried. No, but Albert, quick. Nothing of Albert was visible save his legs. Head and body had completely disappeared. His legs were quite still, and something inside Wallace went down to his boots with a sickening lurch of a badly run endeavor. He put his hand to the snow, grasped the little boy, lifted him up, and came up looking like a small snowman, waddled in his grasp, straightened himself, and suddenly emitted a wail. Oh, where are you hurt? Cried the girl, kneeling beside the child, dabbing the snow from his face and eyes. Albert blinked the water from his vision, meditatively lifted first one, then the other, stopped crying, and said, Why, I ain't. The change was so comical suddenly that both man and girl laughed in nervous relief. Are you sure? Oh, that wasn't nothing. Again, Wallace helped the girl to her feet and said, Are you sure? He asked. I'm all right, she said. I have Albert to land on. You're fine. You're a fine cushion, Albert. I had both of you, Wallace laughed. It was a case of women and children first with a vengeance. Let me brush you off. And so, as he stopped to do so, all three were suddenly aware of how snow bepowdered they were and laughed again, while all the others on the hill who had gathered about laughed with them. Thank heavens we can laugh, Wallace whispered. When I saw those two little legs so still in the snow, I seemed to grow 10 years older. The girl looked at his face and shuddered without speaking. It was as though they had touched hands across a sudden gulf. He brushed the snow from her clothes as best he could, and then spent it off Albert, and on an impulse strange to him, put his arms about the little fellow and gave him a hug. His eyes looked up to meet those of the girl, which were regarding him oddly. I know before that I like kitties, he said as if in apology. You do, I'm sure, she smiled. Before any more tobogganers were allowed to slide, Wallace and his gang made the banks higher and straighter with the dangerous points and thus corrected the chute, and it held like a vice. The coasters were soon whizzing down again. Welcome in. We are reading about the man who found Christmas. Oh, gee, it's dinner time, cried Joe. I'd rather keep, I'd rather slide. The slide will be here this afternoon, Wallace laughed. You go home to dinner before your mother gets after you, Joe. The rest grinned at Joe and followed Wallace and Miss Woodford out of the field. It was a considerable procession which marched up the road. Little Albert refused his aunt's hand, proudly insisting on tugging his own toboggan and chattering of his own adventure. Half a dozen small boys dis, dispute for, disputed for the right to drag Wallace's toboggan. Another boy carried his own snow shovel. Even the bully was in the group. The girl looked back laughing. I believe you are the Pied Piper, she said. If I should confess to you, he answered, that this morning I was afraid of these boys, as timid as a child before them. Maybe you won't believe me, but I'm not used to kids. She again darted an odd look of curiosity at him. Are you visiting in town? She asked. He shook his head. I don't know a soul here. I am at the mission house. I just came. Saw the name North Topsville on the timetable and liked it. I'm hunting for Christmas. Once more she looked at him. It shouldn't be hard to find. Christmas is nearly everywhere, isn't it? Wallace shook his head. I've not met Christmas personally in a decade at least, he answered. The girl paused in front of the house amid the evergreens. I think we can introduce it to you here, she said with a bright smile. We keep quite a supply on hand in Topsville. Then she nodded to him and to the children and turned up the path. The bully touched his cap. Boys, said Wallace, don't you know what to do when a lady meets you or leaves you? What is it, Joe? Joe turned red. Touch your cap, he said. Exactly, said Wallace. And Jim here was the only boy to do it. Good for you, Jim. It was Jim's turn to color with pleasure as well as embarrassment. The other boys looked at him. The villain of the early morning had now become the hero. They scattered their several ways in some perplexity while Wallace walked on to his dinner, every nerve tingling with the excitement of the morning and the unusual contact with small boys and the thrill of little Albert's touch, his warm baby arms and hands, sudden surge of horror at the thought of injury to him, and the feeling of intimacy which followed the accident, the perfume of the girl's hair, and the bright, friendly smile, the whole atmosphere of naivete, enjoyment. It wasn't much like this morning in New York, he reflected. And what an appetite he had. But he discovered after dinner that he was tired and that the muscles in his legs ached from climbing the hill and that his hands were chapped and his face smarted. Welcome on in. We are reading The Man Who Found Christmas. Insolence stole over him and he curled up before the fire in his room and read a book until the light began to fail. Then he went once more into the cold twilight. His feet led him up to the street to the house with the Doric porch. He told himself that he must inquire if Albert were really unhurt. Almost at the gate he met Miss Woodford. Albert and several of the boys, which answered his unspoken question. Hi, we were, we were, where were you this afternoon? Called Joe. Gee, that slide is so slippery now. It's most ice. Yes, and I most fell off again twice, cried little Albert Andrew Goodwin, running up to him and thrusting a tiny hand into his. Did you? Cried Wallace. Well, now, you see why you have to hang on tight, all right. The other boys moved on, and Joe led them in, touching his cap to the girl. That's right, Joe, whispered Wallace as the boy passed. Miss Woodford acknowledged the salute with a bright smile and a good night. The little chap kept fast hold of Wallace's hands. I got a snowman in the backyard. You come and see it, he pleaded, tugging his new friend's fingers. Wallace laughed, a little embarrassed. I guess not today, Albert. It's bedtime for little boys and snowmen. Oh, snowmen don't go to bed at all. I don't go to bed till 7, cried Albert. Please tell him to come, Auntie Nora. You've asked him, dear, said Auntie Nora with a smile. I'm sure he'll come for you. You've asked him, dear. I'm sure he'll come for you, if anybody. Wallace looked at her and met her eyes for a second time and did not tell him to refuse. So, with Albert's hand still tugging at his, he was taken up the path between the evergreens, around the big square house, into the large garden space where the snowman stood with a lump of coal for his eyes. Why, how do you do, Mr. I See Snow? Cried Wallace, pretending to shake his hand. I am glad to see you looking so well. I trust you didn't find this weather too cold for you. Albert shouted with glee. Say it again, he cried. Wallace put his ear to the snowman's mouth and shook his head very gravely. Oh, that's so very sad, he said. Very sad. What does he say? Albert asked, crowding closely. He says he's got such a cold from not wearing a hat that he's lost his voice, Albert answered. The boy looked solemnly puzzled for a second and then burst into great shouts of laughter. Ain't he funny, Aunt Nora? He demanded. The snowmen don't really talk. What? Cried Wallace. Well, I guess you never listened very close. I like you, said Albert, suddenly grabbing his hand again. Come on, see my blocks. Do, added the girl, noting Wallace's hesitancy. We'll have some tea. You are very kind, Wallace answered, but I'm afraid our little friend is forcing your hospitality. We always have tea at this time, she smiled. Her eyes were friendly, her white cap and sweater, and her cheeks red with the day in the open, her hair curling out rebelliously about her temple. She was a temptation hard to resist. The warm little hand was tugging at his fingers, but Wallace managed to say, Another time, Sonny, and made his way to the street. Welcome in. We are reading The Man Who Found Christmas. The next morning, he debated the propriety of going to church. He had not gone to church for so many years that the idea was invested with novelty. Yet he knew that he was going to really see the girl again, and it seemed hardly an appropriate motive. However, he went. A farmer sat directly in front of him with sunburned neck like wrinkled leather rising above a rubber collar. Wallace thought of his own grandfather, who had been a Yankee farmer too, the whole congregation, and the bare meeting house with its gallery on 3 sides and lofty pulpit reached by a winding staircase reminded him of his childhood. He saw Miss Woodford in the choir. She wore black furs, which became her as much as white. Presently she sang a solo, and her voice was sweet and quite evidently trained. Wallace found himself suddenly thrilled by it, as he used to be years ago by the voices of those he loved. And long after the congregation had rustled to silence and the minister had begun to preach, he sat with his eyes on the choir with a delicate revelry. When the sermon was over and the congregation had sung the closing hymn and bowed for the benediction, there was an immediate outpouring from the pews and the hymns of greeting. This was the social hour of the week. The minister came down from the pulpit, exchanged salutations. Children came running in on their way to Sunday school in the vestry. Neighbors chattered in groups. Before Wallace had barely left his pew, a farmer in his starched vest was grasping him by the hand and hoping he would come again. The minister came up and greeted him, and a moment later he saw Miss Woodford drawing near. She put out her hand. "Good morning," she said, and turning to the minister, she added, "Mr. Miller taught some of my boys in one day to do what I've not been able to teach them in a year, to touch their hats. I really think you ought to give him a Sunday school class." "Goodness gracious!" gasped Wallace with such genuine amazement that the others laughed. "I should be delighted to get a man in Sunday school," said the minister. "Who knows, we might start up some Boy Scout work." "Mr. Miller is just the man," said the girl with a twinkle. "I don't think that's fair of you, Miss Woodford," Wallace put in. "For all you know, I'm a heathen, maybe a Pied Piper, as you suggest." "The Pied Piper would have made an excellent scoutmaster," the minister smiled. "Well, Mr. Miller, if you stay in North Topsville long, we shall hope to catch you yet." He moved on, leaving the two young people together. A second woman in a black drew near, a few years older than Miss Woodford. "May I introduce the mother of your friend Albert, my sister, Mrs. Goodwin," said the girl. "I've always delighted in meeting Albert's friends." She smiled. "He tells me you wouldn't come in to see his block. I really think you will have to come, if only to keep him quiet. For tea tomorrow, perhaps." Wallace bowed as Albert's mother passed on. The girl turned towards the vestry. "Now to my class. I do wish you would take it instead." Her eyes met his for a second, half twinkling, half earnest. He shook his head. "Really, I'm unfit. You don't know." He spoke seriously. Their eyes were together a second longer. Unspoken questions passed between them, and then she left him. As she went down the path from the church, he heard behind him the shrill piping of the Sunday school, singing the opening hymn, and he smiled at the sound, for he reflected that, for it had touched. Oh, I got lost. Singing the opening hymn, and he smiled at the sound, for it touched forgotten stops in his memory. Gilsey's, his reflection was about getting up at this moment after his Sunday morning loaf of bread, and was probably swearing at the hot water taps as he shaved himself. Smith and Stedman maybe were finishing breakfast at the club and solemnly debating the tremendous question of how they would kill the remainder of the day. Mercer was getting ready for the Sunday afternoon assignment book in the newspaper office, stale with tobacco smoke of the night before, and doubtless planning to get away early for his bridge game, his Sunday afternoon recreation. How they would all sneer at Wallace if they knew he was coming from church and listening with wistful delight at the drone of Sunday school behind him. Woodford was there and Albert for an hour. Actually, guys, I hope you all are having a great evening. So this has been a long read, and we are about halfway through this book. I am going to stop now for this evening, and we will finish this story on Tuesday at 7:30. I will put the notification so you can go on and click it, get your bells turned on, so when I go live, you're live with me for our Tuesday evening, 7:30 Eastern Standard Time, to finish this book. We are halfway through, and I am kind of done. I have a good hour of reading in me, so I hope everybody is enjoying these Christmas stories. Let me know down in the comment section. I would love to hear from you. Be sure you come back and listen to the first half if you're just popping in now. And remember, we do these readings Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And on Thursday mornings, afternoons, I drop the ASMR video. There's lots and lots, and you never know when I am just going to pop up and pop in for just a live in the afternoon. So be sure you like, comment, subscribe, turn your notifications on. We will finish this story on Tuesday, The Man Who Found Christmas. With that, may everybody have a wonderful December, however you choose to celebrate it.